The clock had just struck 9:45 p.m. when Judge Kimberly Richardson gathered her papers from the mahogany desk in her chambers. She'd spent the last 12 hours presiding over a complex custody case that had left her emotionally drained but determined to ensure justice was served. Her black designer briefcase, a gift from her father when she passed the bar exam, was stuffed with case files she planned to review over the weekend. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty as her footsteps echoed across the concrete. Most of her colleagues had left hours ago, but being thorough was what had earned her reputation as one of the city's most respected judges. At 45, she had worked twice as hard to earn her position, breaking barriers as the youngest black woman to serve on the district court bench. The leather seats of her dark blue Mercedes welcomed her tired body as she settled in for the 20-minute drive home. The car had been her one splurge after her appointment to the bench 3 years ago, a reminder of how far she'd come from the small apartment above her parents' bookstore where she'd grown up. As she drove through the quiet streets of the city's historic district, her mind wandered to the young mother in today's case. The woman's trembling voice as she described her struggles to provide for her children had struck a chord. Kimberly had grown up watching her own mother work 2 jobs to help fund her law school dreams. The late October air was crisp and fallen leaves danced across the streets in her headlights. She was looking forward to changing into comfortable clothes and maybe having a glass of wine while reviewing tomorrow's docket. Her house was just a few turns away in Hampton Heights, an upscale neighborhood where she bought her dream home last spring. Officer James Barrett sat in his patrol car beneath the yellow glow of a street lamp, finishing the last few bites of his dinner, a cold sandwich from the convenience store. At 28, he was still adjusting to the night shift rotation. This was only his 8th month on the force after transferring from a smaller department in the next county over. His training officer had warned him that this city was different, more complex, more diverse, more challenging. He watched cars pass by, his eyes automatically scanning license plates and brake lights, habits drilled into him at the academy. The night had been relatively quiet. A few speeders, one noise complaint at a local bar, and a fender bender in a grocery store parking lot. Nothing like the excitement he'd imagined when he'd first pinned on his badge. The flash of a flickering taillight caught his attention as the Mercedes passed his position. His training kicked in automatically. Defective equipment was a valid reason for a traffic stop, and equipment violations could sometimes lead to more serious discoveries. He didn't know it yet, but this routine stop was about to become anything but routine. Barrett pulled out behind the Mercedes, following it for 2 blocks while running the plates through his computer. The car was registered to a K. Richardson in Hampton Heights. No outstanding violations, registration and insurance current. Everything looked clean, but the taillight was definitely inconsistent. He flipped on his lights. The Mercedes took its time pulling over, though it stayed within the acceptable response time they'd learned about in training. Barrett noticed they were now in Hampton Heights, where the houses got bigger and the lawns more manicured. He'd only made a few stops in this neighborhood, and they usually ended with warnings rather than tickets. The residents here often had connections with City Hall or the department brass. As he stepped out of his patrol car, Barrett adjusted his body camera and touched the reassuring bulk of his flashlight. The night was quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the soft idle of both engines. His boots crunched on fallen leaves as he approached the driver's side window, flashlight beam sweeping across the car's sleek lines. The window hummed as it lowered smoothly, releasing the faint scent of expensive leather and what might have been vanilla air freshener. Barrett's flashlight beam revealed a black woman in business attire, a navy blue blazer over what looked like a silk blouse. She sat with perfect posture, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, just like they taught in driver's ed. "Good evening, ma'am," Barrett began, following his standard script. "I'm Officer Barrett with the City Police Department. I noticed your passenger side tail light is flickering. May I see your license, registration, and insurance?" The woman's voice was clear and measured when she spoke, carrying the kind of authority that usually came with years of professional experience. "Officer, I'd like to understand the full reason for this stop. My lights were serviced last week, and I'm certain they're in proper working order." Something about her tone made Barrett straighten his spine slightly. He was used to a certain amount of pushback during stops, but there was something different about this woman's questioning. She wasn't being belligerent, but she wasn't showing the deference he typically expected either. "Ma'am, I observed the tail light flickering as you passed my position," he repeated, his own voice taking on a firmer edge. "I'll be happy to show you once we've taken care of the documentation." The woman reached for her designer bag in the passenger seat, her movements deliberate and calm. "Officer Barrett, I want to be clear that I'm reaching for my credentials now. However, I'd also like your badge number and the name of your supervising officer." Barrett felt his jaw tighten. In his experience, people who asked for badge numbers were usually trouble, the kind who filed complaints and made things difficult. The training manual said it was their right to ask, but it still felt like a challenge to his authority. What happened in the next few moments would soon become the talk of the department, the subject of news headlines, and a turning point in both their lives. But for now, they were just two people on a quiet street in Hampton Heights, each following their own version of what they thought was right. Little did Officer Barrett know that his next actions would not only change the course of his career, but would spark a conversation that would reach far beyond their city limits. The routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine, and the consequences would ripple through the community in ways neither of them could have predicted. The autumn wind picked up, sending another scatter of leaves across the patrol car's flashing lights. In the distance, a dog barked, and somewhere a car door slammed. Just another night in the city, or at least, that's what it seemed like for now. The night air grew colder as Judge Richardson calmly reached for her bag. Through her car window, she could see Officer Barrett's hand move slightly closer to his belt, a small gesture that spoke volumes. After 15 years in the courtroom, she'd learned to read body language like a book, and everything about the young officer's posture screamed tension. "I'll get my license," she said clearly, making sure her dashboard camera caught her words. She'd installed the camera last year after hearing too many stories from friends and colleagues about traffic stops gone wrong. Not that she'd ever expected to need it herself, but life had taught her to be prepared. Officer Barrett's flashlight beam followed her movements, harsh and bright in the darkness. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he commanded, his voice carrying that edge of authority that fresh officers often use to mask their uncertainty. The judge recognized it well. She'd seen it countless times in her courtroom when new prosecutors handled their first cases. "Officer," she began, her tone professional but firm, the same voice she used when guiding nervous lawyers through difficult proceedings. "I'm reaching for my wallet. It's in my briefcase. I want to be completely transparent about my movements." She narrated each action, a habit she'd discussed countless times during community forums on police interaction. The wind rustled through the trees lining Hampton Heights, making shadows dance across the street. A couple of porch lights flicked on in nearby homes. The neighbors always noticed unusual activity in their quiet community. Judge Richardson could feel her heart beating slightly faster, not from fear, but from a deep, familiar frustration. "Ma'am, you seem very concerned with documenting this stop," Officer Barrett observed, his tone carrying a hint of suspicion. The judge noticed how he shifted his weight, how his free hand rested near his hip. In her mind, she began cataloging every detail, just as she'd advised countless others to do. "Officer Barrett," she responded, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "I believe in the importance of clear documentation for everyone's safety and accountability. Now, would you like to see my license and registration, or shall we continue discussing your concerns about my taillight?" The young officer's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Judge Richardson had seen that look before, the moment when authority feels challenged, even when no challenge was intended. Through her open window, she could smell the lingering scent of fallen leaves mixed with the metallic tang of an approaching storm. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Officer Barrett commanded, his earlier professional demeanor slipping slightly. The judge noticed how his thumb hooked into his belt, how his stance widened just a fraction. More porch lights were coming on now, and she could see curtains moving in nearby windows. "Officer, I don't believe that's necessary," she replied, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. "I'm happy to provide my identification and discuss the taillight, but I'd like to understand why you're escalating this situation." Her years on the bench had taught her the value of creating a clear record, of stating the obvious for future reference. Rain started to fall, light drops creating a gentle percussion on her car's roof. Each drop caught the red and blue lights from the patrol car, turning the scene into a kaleidoscope of colors. The judge thought about her mother's words from years ago. Baby, sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. Ma'am, your attitude is making me concerned for my safety, Officer Barrett stated, his voice taking on that official tone she'd heard in countless bodycam videos played in her courtroom. Please exit the vehicle slowly with your hands where I can see them. Judge Richardson felt a familiar weight settle in her chest, the same weight she carried through law school, through her early days as a public defender, through her first years on the bench. It was the weight of knowing that sometimes, no matter your achievements or position, other people's preconceptions could erase everything you'd worked for in an instant. Officer Barrett, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned her respect in courtrooms across the state. I want to be very clear about what's happening here. I'm a law-abiding citizen who you've stopped for a supposed taillight issue. I've been cooperative while maintaining my rights, and now you're escalating this situation without cause. She could see the moment her words hit him, not their meaning, perhaps, but their delivery. Something about her composure seemed to unsettle him even more. The rain was falling hard now, creating a curtain of water that transformed the patrol car's flashing lights into a blur of color. Thunder rumbled in the distance as more neighbors emerged onto their porches, phones held up to record the scene. Judge Richardson thought about the case she handled that morning, about justice and perception, about how a single moment could change everything. Officer Barrett's radio crackled with static, making him flinch slightly. The judge noticed how his fingers drummed against his leg. A sign of nervous energy she'd observed in countless witnesses. She knew the next few moments would be crucial, could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge. In her rearview mirror, she saw another patrol car turning onto the street, its lights off but moving with purpose. Officer Barrett hadn't called for backup, at least not over his radio, which meant someone else was watching, someone else had noticed. The rain continued to fall, creating a bubble of sound around them. Judge Richardson thought about the young mother from her courtroom that morning, about how systems meant to protect could sometimes do the opposite, about how change only comes when someone is willing to stand firm in the face of injustice. She reached slowly for her phone, making sure her movements were visible and deliberate. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying over the sound of the rain, "I'm going to record this interaction for both our safety. Then I'm going to reach for my identification, which will explain exactly who I am and why the stop needs to end right now." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the next few moments would change both their lives forever. But for now, they remained frozen in this tableau. A young officer and a judge, neither fully aware of the other's true identity, about to learn some difficult but necessary lessons about assumptions, authority, and the complex dance of justice in modern America. The approaching patrol car was 3 houses away now, its headlights cutting through the rain. In moments, everything would change, but these final seconds of misunderstanding would become a powerful lesson for everyone involved. The raindrops fell harder as Judge Richardson carefully reached for her briefcase. Time seemed to slow down, each moment stretching like honey dripping from a spoon. Her fingertips had just brushed the leather handle when Officer Barrett's voice cut through the sound of falling rain. "Stop. Hands where I can see them." His command echoed off the wet pavement. The judge froze, her heart pounding against her ribs, though her face remained composed. 20 years of courtroom experience had taught her how to keep her expression neutral even when her mind was racing. "Officer," she said, her voice steady despite the situation, "my judicial credentials are in my briefcase. If you'll allow me to—" "Out of the car. Now." Officer Barrett's command left no room for discussion. The rain plastered his uniform to his shoulders, and his hand had moved to rest on his holster. In the distance, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the scene like a photograph. Judge Richardson weighed her options. As a judge, she knew her rights down to the letter of the law. As a black woman who'd lived in this country for 45 years, she knew reality didn't always match what was written in law books. Her phone was still recording, capturing every word, every sound. "I want to comply safely," she announced clearly for the recording. "I am going to unbuckle my seatbelt slowly and open my door." She narrated each movement, the way she'd advised countless others to do in her community workshops on civil rights. The neighboring houses were now alive with activity. Faces pressed against windows, and several people stood on their porches with phones raised, recording everything. The second patrol car had parked quietly at the corner, its headlights off but engine running. As Judge Richardson stepped out into the rain, water immediately soaked through her expensive blazer. Her court shoes, which had felt perfectly appropriate in her chambers, now slipped slightly on the wet pavement. She kept her hands raised, visible, remembering every training session she'd attended about these situations. "My name is Judge Kimberly Richardson," she stated firmly, water running down her face. "I serve on the district court bench, and my credentials are in my briefcase. This stop is unnecessary and—" "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Officer Barrett interrupted. His voice had taken on that mechanical quality that often came with uncertainty masked as authority. The judge recognized it from countless rookie lawyers in her courtroom, the tone people used when they were following a script rather than thinking through their actions. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed quickly by a rumble of thunder. The storm was moving in, but a different kind of storm was already breaking around them. Judge Richardson could see neighbors on their phones, no doubt calling the police department, the local news, anyone who might listen. "Officer Barrett," she tried one more time, her voice carrying the weight of her position, "you are making a serious mistake. I am a federal judge and—" "Stop resisting and turn around." The young officer's voice cracked slightly, betraying his growing stress. More lights were coming on up and down the street. The judge could hear distant sirens now, growing closer. With deliberate slowness, Judge Richardson turned to face her car. The rain had made the surface slick, and she placed her hands carefully on the roof. Water ran down her arms, and her silk blouse was ruined, but these weren't the details that occupied her mind. She thought about the cases she'd presided over, about similar situations that had ended tragically. She thought about her position of authority and how, in this moment, it seemed to carry no weight at all. She thought about the young officer behind her, probably scared, definitely unsure, making decisions that would impact both their lives. The cold metal of handcuffs touched her wrists just as another patrol car turned onto the street, this one with its lights flashing. Judge Richardson caught her reflection in her car window, her careful hairstyle now plastered to her head, water running down her face like tears, though she wasn't crying. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, no longer speaking to Officer Barrett, but to the cameras she knew were recording, to the people watching from their homes, to everyone who would eventually see this footage. "And this mistake will teach us all something important." The new patrol car stopped abruptly, and a senior officer stepped out, his face changing from concern to shock as he recognized the woman in handcuffs. "Barrett," he called out, his voice cutting through the rain. "Stop what you're doing right now." But it was too late. The handcuffs clicked shut just as recognition began to dawn on Officer Barrett's face. The young officer had just arrested a federal judge in her own neighborhood, and nothing would ever be the same for any of them. More sirens were approaching now, their wails mixing with the sound of rain and thunder. Neighbors had ventured out despite the storm, forming a circle of witnesses with their phones raised. The senior officer was running toward them, already calling for a supervisor. Judge Richardson stood quietly in the rain, feeling the weight of the handcuffs and the weight of the moment. In her decades of legal practice, she'd seen countless cases that started just like this. But now she wasn't just presiding over the case, she was living it. Lightning flashed once more, illuminating the scene like a stage play. The young officer finally realizing his mistake, the gathering crowd with their recording phones, the senior officer rushing to intervene, and at the center of it all, a federal judge in handcuffs, her expression calm despite the chaos swirling around her. The night had started with a supposedly flickering taillight. It would end as a lesson about assumptions, authority, and the long road ahead in the journey toward true justice. As more police vehicles arrived, their lights painting the rain in red and blue, Judge Richardson thought about tomorrow's headlines, about the conversations this would spark, about the changes that might come from this moment. She stood straight and dignified despite the handcuffs, already thinking about how this incident could be turned into something positive. A teaching moment, a catalyst for change, a story that needed to be told. The rain continued to fall, washing away pretenses and leaving only truth behind. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the booking area. Water still dripped from Judge Richardson's clothes onto the linoleum floor, creating small puddles that reflected the institutional lighting. The handcuffs had been removed, but their phantom pressure lingered on her wrists. Officer Barrett stood in the corner, his face ashen, as senior officers hurried through the doors. The night shift supervisor, Lieutenant Chen, burst into the room with a look of horror on his face. Behind him, the police chief's personal assistant was already making phone calls, her voice urgent and stressed. "Judge Richardson," Lieutenant Chen said, his voice filled with barely controlled panic, "I cannot begin to express. This is..." For perhaps the first time in his 20-year career, the lieutenant found himself at a loss for words. The judge sat calmly in a plastic chair, her dignity intact despite her rain-soaked appearance. She watched the chaos unfold around her with the same careful attention she gave to cases in her courtroom. Junior officers who recognized her were backing away, while those who didn't know her yet could sense something was terribly wrong from their colleagues' reactions. "Someone get the judge a towel and some coffee," Lieutenant Chen barked, trying to regain some control over the situation. 3 officers rushed to comply, nearly colliding with each other in their haste. The booking sergeant, who had been about to take Judge Richardson's fingerprints, now stood frozen with his hand over the ink pad, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. The judge met his eyes steadily. "I believe we can skip the booking process, Sergeant Phillips. Unless you think it's necessary to fingerprint a federal judge." Officer Barrett hadn't moved from his corner. The reality of what he'd done was hitting him in waves. He'd arrested a federal judge. He'd handcuffed a federal judge. He'd ordered a federal judge out of her car in the rain. Each realization felt like another nail in the coffin of his career. "The chief is on his way," someone announced, and the energy in the room shifted again. Officers began straightening their uniforms, brushing off invisible dust, preparing for the storm that was about to walk through the door. Judge Richardson accepted a towel from a wide-eyed rookie officer, dabbing at her face while declining the offered coffee. She'd been in this building many times before, but always as a respected authority figure, never as someone who'd been brought in wearing handcuffs. The precinct doors swung open again, and Police Chief Thompson strode in, still adjusting his tie. Despite the late hour, he was in full uniform, his face set in grim lines. Behind him, the district attorney hurried to keep up, briefcase clutched tightly in his hands. "Judge Richardson," the chief began, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of law enforcement experience. "I was woken up by 6 different phone calls about this incident. The mayor is demanding answers. The press is already gathering outside." The judge held up a hand, silencing him with the same gesture she used in her courtroom. "Chief Thompson," she said, her voice steady and clear, "before we discuss anything else, I want to address Officer Barrett." The young officer looked up, his face a mask of dread. Judge Richardson stood, water still dripping from her clothes, and turned to face him. The room fell silent, every person present holding their breath. "Officer Barrett," she began, "tonight you made assumptions that led to poor decisions. You escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. You ignored clear statements about my identity. These are serious issues that need to be addressed." Barrett swallowed hard, his career flashing before his eyes. But the judge wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "this incident highlights systemic problems that go far beyond one officer's actions. The real question isn't why you didn't recognize me as a judge. The question is why you felt it necessary to treat any citizen this way." The district attorney was scribbling notes frantically. Chief Thompson stood perfectly still, understanding that he was witnessing something important. The room remained silent except for the steady drip of water from Judge Richardson's clothes. "I don't want your badge, Officer Barrett," she said, causing the young officer to look up in surprise. "I want your understanding. I want you to learn from this. And I want every officer in this room to learn from this." Lightning flashed outside the precinct windows, illuminating the room in brief, stark white. The storm was still raging, but inside, something was shifting. The tension in the room was transforming into something else, not quite hope, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Chief Thompson cleared his throat. "Judge, we'll need to take statements, file reports. The media will want answers. The mayor's office will want action." Judge Richardson nodded, finally accepting the cup of coffee someone had placed near her. "Yes, we'll do all of that. But first, I want to make something very clear to everyone in this room. What happened tonight was a failure, not just of training or procedure, but of basic human interaction. She paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with each person present. We have an opportunity here. We can treat this as just another incident report, another embarrassing headline, or we can use it to create real change. The district attorney's pen had stopped moving. Officer Barrett had straightened up slightly, something like hope flickering across his face. Even the booking sergeant had set down his ink pad, listening intently. Outside, camera flashes were visible through the precinct windows as the media gathered. The story was already spreading across social media, carried by the videos taken by neighbors. By morning, it would be national news. But in that moment, in a police precinct still dripping with rainwater, something important was happening. It wasn't just about a judge and an officer anymore. It was about all the similar incidents that hadn't involved federal judges, all the times when there weren't cameras recording, all the moments when authority met prejudice and everyone lost. Chief Thompson looked at his watch, then at the gathering media outside, then back at the judge. "What do you suggest we do next?" he asked, recognizing that the usual playbook wouldn't work for this situation. Judge Richardson sat back down, her wet clothes squeaking slightly against the plastic chair. "Now," she said, "we begin the real work." The storm outside was beginning to fade, but the changes it had brought were just beginning to take shape. The morning after the incident, Judge Richardson's office phone hadn't stopped ringing. News vans lined the courthouse steps, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal sunflowers. Inside her chambers, she sat at her desk, watching the morning sun stream through tall windows, while her assistant fielded the 20th call from national media. No comment at this time, her assistant repeated into the phone, her voice showing signs of wear. "The judge will release a statement when she's ready." The local newspaper lay open on the judge's desk, her own face staring back at her from the front page. The headline read, "Federal Judge Handcuffed in Traffic Stop. Community Demands Answers." Next to it, a still image from a neighbor's phone showed her standing in the rain, hands on her car, dignity intact despite the circumstances. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Chief Thompson entered, looking like he hadn't slept. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd spent the night dealing with the fallout. He carried a thick folder and what looked like his third cup of coffee. "The mayor wants to hold a press conference," he said without preamble, sinking into one of the leather chairs facing her desk. "They're writing statements now, all the usual phrases: full investigation, zero tolerance, comprehensive review of procedures." Judge Richardson nodded, running her fingers along the edge of her desk calendar. "And what do you think that will accomplish, Chief?" He sighed, placing his coffee cup on a coaster. "About as much as the last dozen press conferences after similar incidents. We'll make promises, update some policies, require more training hours." He paused, looking older than his years. "And nothing really changes." "Exactly," the judge said, standing to look out her window at the media circus below. "Which is why we're going to do something different." The chief raised an eyebrow, waiting. He'd known Judge Richardson for years, had testified in her courtroom dozens of times. When she used that tone, something significant was about to happen. "I spent the night thinking," she continued, turning back to face him. "About Officer Barrett, about all the other officers like him. About every traffic stop that didn't end with someone recognizing a judge in handcuffs." Her assistant knocked and entered with a fresh pot of coffee and a stack of messages. "The governor's office called again," she said quietly before slipping back out. Judge Richardson poured coffee for both of them, the familiar routine giving her time to organize her thoughts. "I've spoken with the district attorney and several community leaders. We're not going to let this become just another headline that fades away." She handed the chief a document from her desk. "This is my proposal for a new training program. Not just another sensitivity seminar or cultural awareness workshop. Something real, something that creates actual change." The chief skimmed the document, his expression changing from skepticism to interest. "This is different," he admitted. "Having officers work directly with community members, regular meetings with local leaders, ride-alongs with people from different neighborhoods." "And that's just the beginning," the judge said, sitting back down. "I want Officer Barrett involved in the planning. His perspective matters, the perspective of someone who made mistakes but wants to learn from them." Outside, A group of protesters had gathered, their signs visible from the window. But unlike many previous protests, these people weren't just angry. They were organized, focused, determined to create change. The media wants a story about conflict, Judge Richardson continued. They want anger and demands for punishment. Instead, we're going to give them a story about transformation. Her phone buzzed with another message. The courthouse security chief wanted to discuss increasing protection due to the media presence. She dismissed it with a wave. She had more important things to focus on. What about the officers who'll resist this? The chief asked, though his tone suggested he was already on board. Change isn't easy, especially in a department with decades of established culture. The judge smiled, the same smile she used when making a particularly important point in court. That's exactly why we need to start now. Because it's not easy, because it will take time, because some people will resist. She pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the federal court. I've already spoken with my colleagues on the bench. We're establishing a special committee to oversee police-community relations. Not just another oversight board, but a working group with real power to implement changes. The chief leaned forward, reading through the details. Outside, more protesters were arriving, but these carried different signs, messages of hope and demands for systematic change rather than just punishment. Officer Barrett's body camera footage will be used in training, she continued, not to shame him, but to show how quickly assumptions and fear can escalate a situation. We'll pair it with my own perspective, create a teaching tool that shows both sides. A news helicopter circled overhead, its blades chopping through the morning air. Below, reporters were interviewing community members, capturing stories that would spread across the nation. But this time, the story wouldn't end with just anger and promises. We have a chance here, Judge Richardson said, her voice firm with conviction. A chance to turn this incident into something meaningful. Not just another cycle of outrage and forgotten promises, but real, lasting change. The chief stood, gathering his papers. You know this won't be easy, he warned. Change never is, especially when it challenges people's fundamental beliefs and habits. The judge nodded, thinking about the rain-soaked night that had brought them to this point. Nothing worthwhile ever is, she replied. But that's exactly why we have to try. As the chief left her chambers, Judge Richardson turned back to the window. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Below, protesters and reporters, police officers and community members all moved in their own orbits, unaware that they were about to become part of something bigger than themselves. Her assistant knocked again. Judge, the press is requesting a statement, and the police union representatives want to meet. Schedule them all, Judge Richardson said, straightening her robes. It's time to get to work. The real challenge wasn't what had happened in the rain the night before. It was what they would all do about it now. 6 weeks after the rainy night that changed everything, Officer Barrett stood nervously at the front of the police department's training room. The familiar space felt different today, maybe because of the diverse group filling the seats, or maybe because Judge Richardson sat in the back row, watching quietly. I've gone over this moment in my head hundreds of times, he began, his voice shaky but growing stronger. Every decision, every word, every assumption I made that night. The room was silent, everyone focused on the young officer who had become an unwitting symbol of needed change. The body camera footage played on the screen behind him. The images were clear despite the rain. A routine traffic stop that wasn't routine at all. Barrett forced himself to watch along with everyone else, even though he'd seen it countless times during the investigation. Right there, he said, pointing to the moment he first approached the car. I made my first mistake. Look at my body language, my hand position. I was ready for trouble before there was any sign of it. In the back of the room, Judge Richardson nodded slightly. She'd spent the past weeks working closely with the department, turning a potential crisis into an opportunity for real change. The training session today was part of that process. The footage continued playing, his increasingly aggressive tone, the judge's calm responses, the escalating tension. Barrett paused the video just before the handcuffs came out. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. I had multiple chances to change course, he continued. The judge identified herself several times. She was calm, professional, and within her rights. But I wasn't listening. I was following a script in my head about how these situations should go. A senior officer in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Everyone in the room knew they could have made the same mistakes. That was the point of today's session, not to shame one officer, but to learn from his experience. The police chief stood up, joining Barrett at the front. This isn't about pointing fingers, he reminded everyone. This is about understanding how our assumptions and training can sometimes work against us. Judge Richardson had designed this program herself, insisting that it be more than just another mandatory sensitivity training. The room was filled with a mix of police officers, community leaders, and civil rights advocates. Real conversations happened here, not just lectures and PowerPoints. Barrett clicked to the next slide, statistics about traffic stops in their city. The numbers told a clear story about patterns and prejudices that nobody wanted to admit existed. But today, they were admitting it. Today, they were talking about it. The hardest part wasn't the investigation or the media attention, Barrett admitted, his voice growing stronger. It was realizing that everything I thought I knew about being a good police officer needed to be reconsidered. The judge stood up, walking to the front of the room. She'd worn her regular clothes today, not her judicial robes. This wasn't about authority, it was about understanding. Officer Barrett and I have spent a lot of time talking, she told the room. About that night, about our different perspectives, about why things happened the way they did. These conversations weren't easy, but they were necessary. She turned to Barrett, giving him an encouraging nod. He squared his shoulders and continued. Last week, I did a ride-along in Judge Richardson's neighborhood, he said, not as an officer, but as a passenger while community leaders drove. They showed me their neighborhood through their eyes. I saw all the things I'd missed before. The training room door opened quietly as more officers filed in. Word had spread about these sessions, and attendance was voluntary but growing. Even officers from neighboring districts were asking to participate. We talked about fear, Barrett continued. Their fear during traffic stops. Our fear when approaching vehicles. How those fears feed into each other, creating situations that nobody wants. The judge stepped forward again. Officer Barrett made mistakes that night, she acknowledged. But his willingness to learn from those mistakes, to share his experience with others, that's what real change looks like. Pictures appeared on the screen. Barrett at community meetings, having coffee with local leaders, participating in neighborhood events. Each image showed a different side of policing, one that wasn't taught at the academy. The hardest lesson, Barrett said, his voice steady now, was learning that being a good police officer isn't just about following procedures. It's about seeing people as people, not as potential threats or statistics. The room broke into small discussion groups, officers mixing with community members. The conversations weren't always comfortable, but they were real. No prepared scripts, no defensive posturing, just honest dialogue about difficult topics. Judge Richardson watched it all, remembering that rainy night that could have ended so differently. Instead of lawsuits and protests, they had created something constructive. Instead of division, they were building bridges. Next week, she announced as the session wound down, we'll have officers from the evening shift joining us. Officer Barrett will continue sharing his experience, and we'll hear from community members about their experiences with late-night traffic stops. Barrett gathered his materials, looking more confident than he had in weeks. The weight of his mistake hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something meaningful, a tool for change, a lesson for others. As people filed out of the room, the judge overheard snippets of conversation, officers talking about what they'd learned, community members making plans for future meetings, everyone engaged in the hard work of real change. This is just the beginning, she reminded Barrett as they walked out. Change doesn't happen in one training session or one conversation. It happens day by day, person by person. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Officers and community members walked to their cars together, still deep in conversation. Something was shifting in their city, slowly but surely, one honest discussion at a time. Barrett looked at his watch. He had patrol duty soon, but tonight he would approach it differently. Tonight, he would remember everything he'd learned since that rainy evening when a routine traffic stop became so much more. The judge watched him go, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more conversations, more opportunities for change. But for now, in this moment, something important was happening. Real learning was taking place, and with it, the possibility of lasting transformation. 6 months had passed since that rainy night, and the community center auditorium was packed to capacity. People from all walks of life filled the seats: police officers in uniform, community members in business attire and casual clothes, local leaders, and media representatives. The buzz of conversation filled the air with an energy of anticipation. Judge Richardson stood at the podium, looking out over the diverse crowd. Her hair was styled differently now, but she wore the same determined expression that had carried her through that fateful traffic stop. Next to her sat Officer Barrett, no longer the nervous rookie but now a changed man who had become an unexpected advocate for police reform. "When I was handcuffed in the rain 6 months ago," the judge began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I had two choices. I could let anger guide my response, or I could turn that moment into something meaningful." The audience sat in rapt attention. Many of them had watched the viral videos of that night, had seen the news coverage, had followed the story as it unfolded. But today wasn't about replaying old footage, it was about sharing results. "In the past 6 months," she continued, "over 300 officers have completed our new community engagement program. Traffic stops in our city have decreased by 30%, while positive police-community interactions have increased significantly." Officer Barrett stepped up to the podium, his uniform pressed and neat. The fear and uncertainty that had dominated his face 6 months ago had been replaced by something else: understanding, purpose, growth. "I made a mistake that night," he said, his voice steady. "But that mistake led to changes that none of us could have predicted. Today, every officer in our department goes through intensive training that includes real conversations with community members, not just lectures about procedures." Slides appeared on the large screen behind them, showing statistics and photographs. Officers having coffee with neighborhood residents, community meetings where people actually talked instead of shouted, training sessions where both sides shared their perspectives openly. "We've had our challenges," Judge Richardson acknowledged. "Change isn't easy, and not everyone embraced it at first, but the results speak for themselves." She gestured to a group of police officers sitting in the front row. "These officers have reduced their use of force by 40%, not because they're less effective, but because they've learned new ways to handle difficult situations." The chief of police stood up next, joining them at the podium. "6 months ago, I thought this program would be just another mandatory training requirement. Today, officers from departments across the country are asking to learn from our experience." Videos played on the screen, body camera footage showing officers handling tense situations with new techniques, de-escalating confrontations that might have ended differently before. Each clip demonstrated the practical results of their work. A community leader rose to speak, her voice filled with emotion. "Last month, my teenage son was pulled over for a broken taillight. Instead of fear, he experienced respect. The officer explained everything he was doing, listened to my son's responses, and even helped him schedule a repair at a local garage." The audience applauded, but Judge Richardson raised her hand for quiet. "These are not just feel-good stories," she insisted. "These are examples of real, measurable change. We've documented every interaction, tracked every outcome, and the data supports what we're seeing." Officer Barrett shared his own update. "I still patrol the same streets, but I see them differently now. I see people, not potential threats. I understand that every interaction is an opportunity to either build trust or break it." The judge clicked to the next slide, showing their plans for the future. "We're expanding the program to neighboring districts. We've created a template that other departments can adapt to their own communities. But most importantly, we've proven that change is possible." A reporter raised her hand. "What about critics who say this is just another temporary fix? That things will go back to normal once the attention fades?" Judge Richardson smiled, the same smile she'd worn in the rain that night. "That's why we're here today. Not to celebrate a victory, but to commit to continuing this work. Real change doesn't happen in 6 months, it happens through sustained effort and dedication." She pointed to the back of the room, where new recruits from the police academy sat watching. "These officers will never know the old way of doing things. They're starting their careers with a new perspective, a new approach, a new understanding." Officer Barrett stepped forward again. "6 months ago, I thought my career was over. Today, I teach other officers how to avoid the mistakes I made. But more importantly, I teach them why those mistakes matter and how we can do better. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but the judge wasn't finished. This isn't the end of our story, she declared over the applause. This is just the beginning. Every traffic stop, every interaction, every moment is a chance to prove that change is possible. As the crowd began to mingle and discuss, Judge Richardson watched Officer Barrett speaking with a group of young officers. His gestures were animated, his face earnest as he shared his experience. She thought about that rainy night, about how a moment of crisis had transformed into a catalyst for change. Outside the community center, the sun was setting on another day in their changing city. Police cars drove past with officers who had been through their program. Citizens walked the streets with a little less tension in their shoulders. It wasn't perfect. Change never is. But it was real, and it was lasting. The judge gathered her papers, ready to head back to her chambers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to build on what they'd started. But for now, she allowed herself to feel something that had been rare in her years on the bench: hope for the future and pride in how far they'd come.